Okay. Hi Jared. Hi Dr. Parker. Welcome back to my View of It channel for this week. So this week's question was, what can we learn about the medieval society by examining their homes? So although we tend to look at the past through a lens of our own experiences or our own culture, the medieval homes reveal an enormous amount about just how different their world was from our own, or how the medieval world was from our own. We can learn about the pervasiveness of social hierarchy, the impact of political and economic stability on peasants, and the rhythm of the medieval day and night. So my first point is going to be the social hierarchy was literally everywhere, and you could find this in their homes and in people's lives. So one place you could find it was the Ladar, which was the food pantry or a food storage place. So the medieval people thought that your class determined what foods were appropriate for you to eat. So we can see this, a lot of the peasants and stuff ate more of the homegrown foods and not like as many meats and stuff as where the upper class, richer people ate more of the sifted flour, meat, the good stuff. But they thought your stomach was like this mini oven, so you would just put in what they thought you should be. So the second thing you can see hierarchy is through their wardrobes. So there were these laws called the Simpertury laws, and they basically set limits on what you could consume. So like peasants couldn't hunt for deer and stuff like that, but they could eat hedgehogs, so that was one of the things. But it also stopped people from wearing a certain color or a certain kind of clothing, or different kind of clothing, based on, or stop people from wearing a certain style or whatever, from a higher class. So for example, the priests and bishops would have different colored robes or different types of robes to simplify if they were higher in the line of church hierarchy, or and also the races would have certain types of clothing. So you can see there's a Jewish hat that kind of looks like a bell, that the Jews would wear. So there was also this little creature called it was a small weasel, usually had white fur in the winter, and this animal was highly linked with royalty. It was called an ermine, and it was super popular because of this legend that said that ermines would rather die than be defiled. So it's just a very like royal people would rather die than give up their crown or whatever. So it became this symbol of royal and moral purity. And they're very cute, and so that was kind of, the hierarchy system of that. Third type you could see it in is the architecture of the actual homes. So the rich built their homes with timber, and this demonstrated their power and wealth. You can still see these homes today. They're very beautiful. They're very sturdy. They're still up and running. People are still living in them. And they, so timber was just basically like, an actual tree, basically. As where peasants would build with coppiced wood. And so coppiced wood was when you would cut the trees down, and leave it like at the base, and then in the winter it would have time to grow or whatever, and it would grow back with lots of thin, little branches coming up, that the peasants would cut down and use. So they had to use the coppiced wood because, excuse me, because they were not allowed to cut down the trees because they were scared that it was like a death penalty for cutting down trees and also for hunting for certain types of animals. So they decided to play it safe and just use the coppice trees or make coppice wood. Christopher Dyer actually says, though, that, quote, some peasants enjoyed the rights of house butte, I think, entitling them to take some building timber from the Lord's wood, but the right was supervised by the Lord's officials, and the quantities of the timber taken were rarely enough to build a complete house, end quote. So they would, were able to get some of the timber, but not very much. So if you look at a medieval upper class, middle class house, it's going to be very, very different from a lower class peasant house, which is just super interesting. So let's move on to our second point. Is medieval home tells us about the impacts of the political and economic instability within the peasants. So the rich had these big towers, these big castles, as we've studied, with walls and moats and towers and lookouts and all that, fun stuff. And it was used for protection. It looked intimidating. It was intimidating. Had a lot of, good protection elements. But the peasants had to rely on, they didn't have that, so they had to rely on staying in close groups for protection. So the peasant's home would usually have one room with very little privacy, few belongings, and it was always filled with animals and people. So the medieval just bed, because they only had one room, was not a individual quiet time alone place. It was still a social place for the medieval people. Your whole family would sleep in the same bed, and they usually had a lot of kids, so it would be quite tight. And their guests would also sleep in the same bed with them if they had guests. You had key events that would take place in your bed, like death and birth. It's kind of crazy, and again, there was just very little privacy within death and birth and the bed. Travelers would sleep with other travelers, and there was these, rules or laws that, not laws, they were like rules, or kind of like a social, like, you don't do that, of just being considerate when, sleep on your half of the bed, I'll sleep on my half, we're gonna turn it midnight or whatever, and stuff like that. So Roger Ertree says, quote, sharing not only the same room but also the same covers conserved resources and generated welcomed warmth, end quote. So again, we look at this as kind of like, I'm not going to share a bed with my whole family, but they looked at it as, this is protection and this is providing warmth, and it's a good thing. So it's just kind of interesting how we can see the difference between cultures and between time periods. Third point that I am going to be making today is the proximity of large groups of people in one space, and the lack of artificial light gave medieval life a very different rhythm. So the lack of privacy gives us an insight of just how differently the medieval life was from today. People and animals all lived in one house. They would let the animals out, and then when it started to become nighttime, they would bring the animals back in, and they would all sleep in the same house. So, before artificial lights like candles, and now we have, whatever, we have lamps, why can't I think of that, and cell phones and stuff like that, people would just go to bed when the sun went to bed. So, they would usually just go to bed around sunset. And it was very interesting. Again, Roger Ernick or whatever kind of figured this out, talks about it, is that they had this first sleep and second sleep. So they would go to bed when the sun set and they would sleep until about midnight, and then they would wake back up and do whatever, and then they would go to bed, and that would be like their second sleep, and then they would wake up when the sun came up. So both of these sleeps last around the same time, and it's really interesting. And so, they even say, like, and if people went to bed later than sunset, they would wake up later in second sleep, or they would maybe not even wake up until the dawn, which is like what we do today, because we don't, most of us go to sleep at like 10 or 11, and so we don't experience second sleep. But you can try it. Chaucer, the author of Canterbury Tales, actually talks about this when he's telling one of his stories. He talks about the character saying, "Oh, after first sleep," and she like went to first sleep, and then all of her friends were still asleep because they went to bed later. So it's just very interesting. Dr. Parker says, quote, "The rhythm and pattern of the typical person's day would have been almost unrecognizable to the modern person," end quote. So it's just kind of crazy to think about that, we wouldn't even recognize the medieval life just by looking at their homes and the kind of lives they lived. So that we tend to look at the past through the lens of our own experiences and cultures, medieval homes reveal an enormous amount of just how differently our lives are from their lives. And we can see this through the hierarchy, social hierarchy, the impact of political and economic instability on the peasants, and the rhythm of the medieval day and night, and first sleep and second sleep. So, hope you have fun watching this, Jared and Dr. Parker. Have a great week and /week, and yeah, I will see you guys Wednesday. Bye.